Alright, folks. So today is the last installment of the Wabain Marxist Historical Materialism Subseries. My goodness, that's a mouthful. Never came up with a better name for it, but today we're going to be looking at the historical Wabian Marxism for cultural policy. Alright? So basically, these are cultural institutions and how they work, and basically reducing the amount of concentration of power in all of these cultural institutions. So first off, we start with the first stage, which is the ultra-traditionalist stage. All right? Now, ultra-traditionalism is categorized by where culture and tradition are the strongest force in people's lives, all right? So, culture and tradition, they are extremely powerful. They have pretty much all the power. So, really, under historical Wabian Marxism, primitivism, monarchism, and ultra-traditionalism are supposed to exist. You're supposed to have all people be economically enslaved, all people be politically enslaved, and all people being culturally enslaved at the same time. That's supposed to be the first stage of Wabian Marxist historical materialism. If you want to find out these other types more in detail, this economic area and this governmental area right here more in detail, then I will have those videos linked in the description of this video. All right, so let's start going into detail about the three substages of ultra-traditionalism. First off, we have regressive ultra-traditionalism. All right. Basically, there is an effort to regress forever. So what does that mean? Well, first off, that means that there is an active effort by society to regress either to a more traditional outlook of the world or to maintain their current outlook with no deviation at all. All right? So basically, it's just the idea that you got to be real stiff-neck, pretty much, in order to be a regressive ultra-traditionalist. But then we move on to the next substage, which is neutral. This is where the theocracy is cracked. Now, you're going to be seeing something interesting here. So, basically, under ultra-traditionalism, there are multiple things. So, there is a theocracy, there's a patriarchy, there's an ethno-state, all right? There is cultural criticism is illegal, and people who are disadvantaged by society, like the poor, the disabled, and former criminals, they are just removed in social Darwinist policies. All right? So that's regressive ultra-traditionalism. That's pure ultra-traditionalism. Under neutral ultra-traditionalism, the theocracy becomes cracked. What that basically means is that other doctrines of a specific religion are no longer illegal. They are just not the supreme doctrine. They're just, they're allowed, but that's about it. Laws are going to be made by the primary religion. All right, so it's still technically a theocracy, but it's not a hardcore theocracy. And then we have accelerated ultra-traditionalism, which is where the theocracy has been reformed. Okay, basically, this is the idea, all right, where All religions, not just including different doctrines of the religion of the primary religion, are allowed. So secularism has been established, but there's still a primary religion that makes up a majority of the laws. It's still you're allowed to be in a different religion, but there's just a primary religion about it. All right. So now that we've gone through accelerated ultra-traditionalism, let's go. That leads us to regressive traditionalism. So what characterizes traditionalism? Basically, traditionalism is where glimpses of progress can break through. Basically, it's the idea that you're still extremely focused on maintaining tradition and culture, but you're allowing certain glimpses of progression. You're allowing some things to progress a little bit more. You're no longer a bunch of monkeys, all right? So regressive traditionalism is where other races and ethnicities are beginning to be allowed into the society. So now this doesn't necessarily mean, this basically means that there ain't no ethno-state no more. Alright? You're allowed to go in and out of the country, pretty much. You're allowed to go in and out of the society, mingle a little bit, but you're still going to be heavily oppressed. Alright? But then we have neutral. Neutral traditionalism is where discrimination by the government against people of different races and ethnicities stop. So pretty much this is just legal. Legally, the government cannot discriminate against you based on race. Whereas under regressive traditionalism, they still could. You are still allowed to. Under ultra-traditionalism, you're not allowed. Someone of a different race is not allowed in an ultra-traditionalist society. But in traditionalism, you are allowed. The difference between regressive and neutral is that under regressive, the government can discriminate against you, but under neutral, they can't. We then have accelerated traditionalism, which is where women are given partial humanity. So basically, this cracks the theocracy. This makes the theocracy no longer the patriarchy no longer as powerful. All right. So earlier, up until this point, we have made women to be objects. They're objects to be. They can be bought and sold. Men can have multiple women as wives. They don't have a say. They don't have rights. They don't have nothing. But under accelerated traditionalism, they're at least given partial humanity. They might be given like a partial vote, like how the U.S. did for black folks. The U.S. Right at the beginning for black folks, 5 black people were counted as one person. This is the same thing applied to women. So basically, women go from being made into an object to being a partial human, pretty much. Which is an improvement, but it ain't much of an improvement, if you know what I mean. We then move on from accelerated traditionalism to regressive modernism. Modernism is characterized by tradition no longer being the most important force in culture. All right? Tradition is no longer held as this pseudo-religious pedestal. It's no longer basically God's law, Under traditionalism and ultra-traditionalism, tradition and culture would be seen as more of like divine law. You do not speak against tradition. But under modernism, you got a little bit more wiggle room. It's no longer seen as the most important force in your life. So here we have regressive modernism, which is where the government give women full human status. All right. So under regressive modernism, it builds off of accelerated traditionalism. So basically, the feminist movement moves on and gives women full human status, which gives women an equal standing in before the law. We then have neutral modernism. Oh goodness, I skipped it a little bit too much. But neutral modernism is where cultural criticism is no longer censored. So up until this point, we've had lots of rights. We've gotten some religious rights. We've gotten some racial rights. We've gotten some women's rights. But now we have to deal with counterculture movements. Movements that are also oppressed but may not necessarily fall into those categories. Like the Pride community, for example. They would be considered counterculture movements because they're criticizing the current culture. So, under neutral modernism, cultural criticism is no longer censored, but it's still oppressed. Alright? It's still heavily oppressed by the government. We then have accelerated modernism, which is where the legal oppression of cultural minorities is removed. Basically, it's the idea that the government is no longer legally allowed to oppress people just because they're criticizing culture. All right. So basically, under an accelerated modernist society, you begin to gain the right to criticize culture. That's huge given where we've gone. It's still not the best, but we're getting there. We then move on to postmodernism. Postmodernism is where traditional institutions become more regulated. So basically it's just the evolution of modernism. Postmodernism is just the evolution of modernism, and it's where tradition is just, kind of phasing out a little bit by the more modern generation. What we typically think of, they're no longer... They're becoming less and less traditional over time. So basically, under postmodernism, the social Darwinist policies utilized against the disabled and the former criminals and the poor and all that stuff, that no longer exists under a postmodern society. All right? They're no longer forced to not procreate, if you know what I mean. Basically, they're no longer eradicated. They're no longer tried to get out of the gene pool type of thing. We then have neutral postmodernism, which is where euthanasia is stopped. This is the idea. Basically, this is where social Darwinism applies to everybody, including criminals and the poor. Basically, social Darwinists' policies are the idea that you should apply natural selection to everything going on. So if somebody has a weak social standing, like, for example, if they're a former criminal or if they're poor, then that means they ought not to survive. So under social Darwinism, that would be, if you remove social Darwinism, then all that's really left are people like the disabled and people with genetic conditions and that kind of thing. But under neutral postmodernism, even that is removed. There's no longer any form of euthanasia. And then we move on to accelerated postmodernism, which is where disabled, poor, and former criminals begin to have legal equality. That means that the government no longer discriminates between disabled, poor, and former criminals in a society. They begin to have legal equality. They are legally equal citizens, all right? they have equal rights. They are not restricted in any way. If it doesn't matter if you're disabled, poor, or if you have a criminal record, you still have the same rights as somebody who isn't disabled, isn't poor, and doesn't have a formal criminal record. All right? But so now let's move on to progressivism. So we've gone past postmodernism. Now let's go to progressivism. So regressive progressivism. So what is progressivism? Basically, it's where society begins to have an attitude of advancement. So they begin to not only begin to kind of reject tradition like under postmodernism, they begin to actively seek to replace tradition with advancement, with various advancements, various forms of progress. So here we have regressive progressivism. This is where secularism and affirmative action are fully established. So basically what this means is that there is complete religious equality, and there is an affirmative action system to ensure that people of different races are guaranteed to have equal opportunities in life. Not equal outcomes, but equal opportunities in life. All right? So, but there's still some form of oppression and stuff. Then we have neutral progressivism. This is where transsexual and transgender people are legally accepted. Now, this basically means that people who transition to the opposite gender either culturally, meaning they don't actually change their body, or biologically, where they actually try to change their body. They become legally accepted members of society under progressivism. All right? And that increases legal gender equality. That's the primary reason. The thing is, even though this in our current societies are considered counterculture movements, they also work as an extension of gender equality. So that's why that's here too. So basically, this is a form of gender equality that goes past the simple men and women are now equal. And then we have accelerated progressivism, which is where society is actively listening to cultural criticism and accommodating for the poor, disabled, and former criminals. So basically what that means is that people who are criticizing culture in different ways, they are being actively given a platform and being listened to on that platform. And at the same time, society is beginning to try and accommodate for people who are poor, disabled, or former criminals. So that would look like, for example, prison reform. You have a more reformed thinking. Like, for example, think Finnish prisons. That would be an example of society accommodating former criminals. Prisons become a way to train people how to get out of a life of crime and become a functioning member of society. We also have accommodation for the disabled, which would be like, for example, adding more ramps than stairs in most public places and all that kind of stuff, and making sure that these people have what they need. And also accommodating for the poor. You have more homeless shelters, and maybe you have free housing, or more food kitchens become stuff like that. Basically, society becomes much more open to criticism of tradition and begins to accommodate people who are disadvantaged a lot more than under everything else, pretty much. But that leads us to ultra-progressivism. So we've reached progressivism. Now let's go to ultra-progressivism. Ultra-progressivism is characterized where cultural progression becomes the most important element of culture. All right? So progression becomes more important than tradition, and so it's kind of the opposite of ultra-traditionalism, where tradition was the most important element of culture. Under ultra-progressivism, progression is the most important element of culture. So here we have regressive ultra-progressivism. This is where a hybrid theocracy and racial ethnic concessionalism is set up. So basically what this means is that that in order for basically it's the idea that the government, instead of just doing basic secularism and allowing everybody to live by their religion in peace as long as it don't mess with the laws, a hybrid theocracy actually incorporates every single religion and represents every single religion in its lawmaking process. And it represents them all equally. So that's what a hybrid theocracy is where every single religion that exists is represented equally before the law and has a say in the creation of said laws. There are other ways of forming hybrid theocracy. For example, if you have a more anarchistic or minarchistic system, you might be able to use like a plurality of force type of thing and an opt-out system to make it to where you literally live in the theocracy of your choice. And everyone around you are also doing the same for different theocracies. That would also be considered a hybrid theocracy, but that's pretty much exclusive to anarchism and maybe really weird minarchists. But even then, it'd be a really weird minarchism. But we also have racial and ethnic concessionalism. So basically, racial/ethnic concessionalism is the idea that we don't just need equal opportunity. All right? If we have oppressed an ethnic or racial minority in the past, this is the idea that we should actively bring in concessions for what they did so that we could hopefully make it to where we can make their current lives equivalent to what their lives would have been had they had equal opportunity when we oppressed them. All right, so that's the idea of racial/ethnic concessionalism. All right. We then have neutral ultra-progressivism. So neutral ultra-progressivism is the idea that non-binary people become accepted members of society. Basically, this is the idea that transsexual and transgender people, they've been accepted for a little while under an ultra-progressive society, but under a neutral ultra-progressive society, non-binary people become included in that transsexual, transgender thing and are no longer oppressed. They become almost normal type, They become at least equal under the law. They become normal, average people in society, not anything real special, just, that person's non-binary. They aren't a male or a female. They're just something. They're just them. They're just themselves. And that would be normal under a neutral, ultra-progressive society. All right. We then have accelerated. Oh boy. We then have accelerated ultra-progressive societies, which is where counterculture movements are directly supported by society as a whole, and all non-governmental institutions are technocratically governed. So, this is what this means. Basically, this is the idea that we take the attitude of, cultural progression being the most important element of culture under ultra-progressive society. This is the ultimate manifestation of that. Because counterculture is the heart of cultural progression, and an accelerated ultra-progressive society would directly subsidize counterculture movements. They would directly support counterculture movements and actively try to accommodate counterculture movements in an attempt to progress as quickly as possible. They would also make all non-governmental institutions. So think things like schools, prisons, libraries, workplaces, all that kind of stuff. They become technocratically governed. All right? Which means they become governed by expert advice and the scientific method, which is basically the idea that most of society should be ultra efficient through technocratic governance, And I'm not saying central planning necessarily. This isn't necessarily central planning. This is smaller. This is like on the institutional level rather than on the national level. So, like businesses would be technocratically governed and all that kind of stuff. So experts would be in charge of that, and everything would be done based on the scientific method. Alright, so now that we've gone through all that, let's take a look at how all this would fit together. Going all the way from the beginning. So this is what society should go down according to Wabain Marxist Historical Materialism. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that society is going to go down that route. This is just the natural way that society goes down. All right? So we start off with primitivism, which is the idea that because a society is so primitive, they're hunter-gatherers, the economics are so inefficient that all people are economically enslaved. The material quality of life has put them in a position where every single person is enslaved. Their labor is completely controlled by their basic survival. We also have monarchism, which is where one person has absolute power over everybody. This person has the complete ability to make and enforce laws. Now, if you apply it to primitivism, you typically think, like a chieftain, And then we have ultra-traditionalism, which is where culture and tradition are the most important thing in people's lives. People's lives are completely controlled by tradition. Their entire worldview is built off of tradition and how it used to be. Basically, oral law. Alright? So, basically, you are completely materially enslaved. There is a complete concentration of power into one person. And tradition makes up your entire worldview. Alright? So, that is the first stage of Wabian Marxist historical materialism. But let's move on. Let's move on to the second stage. So, here we have agrarianism. Agrarianism is the idea that there is a enslaved and semi-free class of people. That the material conditions have improved to where there is a small class of people that do have free time to themselves. They do have time that they can control, although the majority of their time nobody can control. All right? So basically, under agrarianism, most people are enslaved, and those that aren't enslaved are partially enslaved. We then have dictatorship, which is where the supreme leader is appointed outside of inheritance or military power, which means that there is a slight reduction in the concentration of power. There is a small class of people underneath the supreme leader that do have political power. It's no longer only one person with all the political power. And then we have traditionalism, which is where progress begins to be allowed. Progress enters into people's worldview and becomes allowed. All right? People's worldview accepts progress at least slightly. All right. Then we have the third stage. All right. We have serfdom, where a truly free class, a partially free class, and an enslaved class are formed because the economy becomes efficient enough for a truly free class to exist. All right. We then move on to oligarchy, which is where the concentration of power expands even farther, and there's no longer one person in control of everything. There is no longer a single supreme leader to look up to. All right? There's multiple people that share that position. All right? And then, associated with that, we have modernism, which is where tradition no longer becomes the most important force in culture. It is where progress becomes just as important as tradition. This is huge. This is huge. Now let's move on to the fourth stage, which is capitalism. This is where all people are at least semi-free. The enslaved class of people is removed. Now, there may be the occasional slave every now and then, but it's rare. So all people become at least semi-free. Partial slavery is the most slavery you should get because of your material conditions, of course. We then have democracy, which is where no one person or group has absolute power. Basically, everyone begins to divulge in a little bit of the political power, a little bit of the political process. Everybody becomes involved. It's no longer just a certain group of elites that has all the power. And associated with that is postmodernism, which is where tradition begins to be abandoned. You're beginning to abandon tradition a little bit. You still have tradition, but it's beginning to be abandoned. All right? You're beginning to start transitioning away from tradition being the most important aspect of your worldview as a society. And now we move on to the fifth stage, all right, which is where all people are free. The semi-free thing, it's gone. It is gone. There's no longer semi-free. There's no longer partial slavery. It still exists sometimes, but again, just like under capitalism, it's rare. And that means that complete slavery is extremely rare under socialism. Well, that is true socialism, I might say. And then we have minarchy, This is where all people have a significant amount of power. They share power with the government. All people share power with the government under monarchy. No longer is the power just in participating in the political process. There is participation in the political process, but you also directly have power as a citizen under monarchy. And then we have progressivism, which is where society has transitioned from an attitude of tradition being a significant portion in culture, being where tradition becomes ultra important in your worldview, to where advancement becomes the most important view in your culture. And then we move on to the final stage of Wabian Marxist historical materialism, which is communism. This is where the bureaucracy has been removed, and slavery and semi-slavery have become even rarer as quality of life significantly increases. And then we transition to anarchy. All right, so anarchy is where the government is no more, and the people themselves have all of the political power. There is a complete decentralization of power. There is no concentration of power at all. None. And so that's removed. And then we have ultra-progressivism, which is where cultural progression becomes the absolute most important element of culture. And culture progresses very rapidly and quickly with extreme priority. So now that we've gone over the entirety of Wabian Marxist historical materialism, let's take a look of what it would be like to be an average citizen under the neutral versions of all of these stages. So let's look at the first stage, all right? You spend pretty much all day on your basic survival. You got tents, you got a place to sleep, but you got to move them basically every day to chase your prey. And you have to please the chief and the elders completely. All right. They have absolute power, and you cannot question their power. They have all the authority. So if they ask you to do something, you've got to do it. It doesn't matter if you're going to go hungry tonight. You've got to do it still. Now, and you are allowed to have a different religion, but everyone knows that there is a prime religion that has to be appeased, and if you do a different religion, you still have to accommodate that primary religion, and you're still going to be oppressed by that primary religion, even though you're technically allowed to have your own religion. So that's the first stage. That's the average citizen's life in the first stage. But what about the second stage? Well, under the second stage, you have permanent architecture. You're probably not going to be in that semi-free class, but you have the opportunity to enter into that semi-free class. And your quality of life has improved as a slave from, the primitive society. You do have a permanent home over your head, and you are fed. You don't go hungry quite as often. But this time, you don't got a chieftain, you got a supreme leader. And that leader is appointed by officials that you get to elect. Even though you're a slave, you still get to appoint these officials. And these officials appoint the dictator. So you get a lot of issues that you face gets seen by the supreme leader, and the supreme leader has an obligation to fix them. All right, so you have more representation, you have more power, and then you also have restrained secularism, which is where there is a primary religion, but it's no longer oppressing other societies. You're just secular. And but you also have it to where different ethnicities are no longer legally allowed to be discriminated by the government. Now, certain individuals may still oppress them, but legally the government will not oppress different races. So you're probably the average citizen, a part of a minority group that is sitting there all worried about all these new racial people coming in and living amongst you, and so you're a little bit confused by that, and they're having to have equal opportunity, and so you have that kind of idea in your head. But then we have the third stage. This is serfdom. Basically, there are this merchant class, which means that the truly free class and the semi-free class are quite large, which means there is a decent chance you could be in the semi-free class. Now, basically, it's pretty much a 50-50. It's pretty much a 50-50 whether or not you are in the slave class or the semi-free class, but there is much more of a chance that you could at least enter into the semi-free class relatively easily with enough effort. And so there's that. But you also got oligarchy. This is where you elect the people that appoint the people that share the power, which means that you have even more representation in power. Your representation is much more powerful. It's exponentially more effective than under the same form of dictatorship. So it's much, much more likely that the oligarchy will appease the problems that you face than than the same type of dictatorship. All right? And so, but under the same vein, you also have women being equally free. So women are now completely equal to men, and cultural criticism is no longer censored. Now, cultural criticism, it is still pressed. It's still legally pressed, but it's no longer censored. You still hear about people criticizing culture, and you hear what they say. It's just they're oppressed, and they're just no longer censored, and that's about it. But now let's move on to the fourth stage, which is the capitalist stage, which is where all people are at least semi-free. This one, you're basically guaranteed to be a semi-free person, where only a part of your life is enslaved. The globalization, slavery has been eliminated. Globalization has been opened up, which means that it is now much more likely that you can transition from semi-free to fully free as well. You can set up a company, and if that company is successful, you can be free. You can be a free person, and that's huge. That's huge. Semi-free people can be free now, and that's very, very different from all the previous ones. So that's a huge boost in quality of life. We then have a liberal democracy, which is where a presidential system has been set up. no longer is there this one person or group of people that has all their power, and the most powerful position in this government is directly elected by you. You elect the most powerful person in the government, and even the most powerful person in the government does not have all the power anymore. So this is huge. Your problems and the problems that you face are just, they're no more. They are represented all the time. You have tons of representation under democracy. And then we move on to postmodernism, which is where not only has legal oppression of cultural minorities stopped, but social Darwinist policies and euthanasia is no more. If you end up on the underbelly of society, you no longer have to be afraid of being shot by the government. You don't need to be afraid of that no more, because euthanasia and social Darwinism are gone. And you can begin to criticize culture without fear of being oppressed by the government. You don't have to fear being arrested or none of that stuff. And so, really, there's a huge increase of the quality of life in that on the fourth stage. But we also have a huge increase in the quality of life on the fifth stage, which is where all people are free. And we have middle socialism, which is the worker controls the means of production, which means that the chances of being semi-free are extremely low. They're much lower than under early socialism. So the chances are you are a free person. You control your time completely. You have full control over your time. You get to control when and where you go to work, or if you go to work. You have that authority over your own life. And that just don't exist under capitalism. And so you're just free. You're a free person. You're finally a free person. And so then we move on. So if you're free economically under liberal socialism, what about under liberal minarchy? Well, that means basically under liberal minarchy, you have more power. You as a citizen have more political power than the government. You have more authority than the government as your average citizen. So you now have these powers that was previously only held by the most powerful people in society, for the majority of society, under liberal socialism and under middle socialism and liberal minarchy. But what about cultural values? How does that happen? Well, there is now equal opportunity. There's now equal. You don't have to worry about getting on the underbelly of society no more, because even if you get on the underbelly, you still are guaranteed at least society trying to make it to where you have an equal quality of life with everybody, regardless of if you're disabled, poor, or have a criminal record. And there is secularism and affirmative action, meaning different races and different religions are now completely equal and have equal opportunity. There's no longer oppression of religion and racial minorities. There's also transsexual and transgender people being fully accepted legally. They are now legally accepted. And basically what that means is that now there is the chances that now there's complete gender equality, because there's no real distinction anymore. It's just equal. It's just equal. Even if you're changing your gender, you're still equal. with people who didn't. But what about the sixth stage? What about the sixth stage? The average person under the sixth stage of Wabian Marxism. Well, basically, under socialism, you can't get more free than complete freedom. All right? So, it's just increases of quality of life beyond that. All right? So now you have the creation of a work-based currency, which makes it to where your money begins to go farther and prices are cheaper, and that's really it. But you also have complete decentralization of the economy, which means that planning becomes a lot more, and the decentralization of the planning process, which means that planning becomes a lot more efficient. There's a lot more stuff going on. There's a lot more stuff being produced at much higher qualities and quantities, and they're a lot cheaper, and your money just goes farther. Period. Plus the fact that you have complete control over your work. You have the complete control over whether you work and all that stuff. So it is extremely rare to be partially enslaved, and basically impossible to be fully enslaved. And so it's very likely that you are free and that your quality of life is very high, like most people in other systems would consider you wealthy under communism. And then you have anarchy, which is where people can opt out of laws they can disagree with, and individuals can choose what police system they are under. So basically, there is no longer a government. There is a complete decentralization of power. You no longer have to answer to really anybody. You still have laws, but you make the laws. You are a part of the lawmaking process directly, and you are a part of the law enforcement process directly, and you control who gets what punishment if they break a law. You're a part of that process too. So really, there is nobody you have to answer to except everyone else, except your fellow citizens. That's it. But you're a part of your fellow citizens. So everybody has to answer to you, and you have to answer to everybody. It's a complete decentralization of power. Plus the fact that under liberal anarchy, you can opt out of laws that you disagree with an opt-out system. Now, of course, it would have limits, but if you disagree with a particular law, you might not have to be forced into that. You might be able to maybe move into an area where that wasn't the case, or be under a militia that allowed for that. But what about worldview? Well, under worldview, society is now actively listening to cultural criticism and accommodating for people who are poor and disabled. So now, not only are people not oppressed, basically oppression is no more. Actual oppression is no more anymore, because non-binary people are now accepted, and people who are cultural minorities are being actively listened to, and people who are disabled are being accommodated for. But now we have a hybrid theocracy and ethnic concessionalism, which gives equal opportunity to everybody, along with that non-binary people being accepted members of society. So basically with each stage, your quality of life as an average citizen increases in every way with each of these stages. Now, something about Wabian Marxist historical materialism that you have to understand here is that it is not cut and dry. there is a lot of mixing and matching. For example, take the USSR. The USSR was a dictatorship that was socialist. So it had stage 5 economics but a stage 2 government and a stage 3 culture. So it mixed and matched things a lot. It mixed and matched things a ton. But the natural progression of human society is supposed to be this. It is supposed to be stage 1 on all 3, stage 2 on all 3, stage 3 on all 3, stage 4 on all 3, on and on and on, up until stage 6. And finally, you reach at the end of stage 6, which is the beginning of a truly post-scarcity society. It is the beginnings of a society where we can begin to graduate from, maybe we could graduate from Earth, or develop into a type, and we graduate from measuring society on this scale to measuring society on scales like the Kardashev scale, where you measure society's advancement based off of technology. However, so far no human society has ever reached the end of stage 6 on any of these, really. But really the goal is to reach the end of stage 6. And there are a lot of possible reasons for why it doesn't happen. Honestly, human society does not work in a vacuum, and that's really just the best explanation for it. There is always interactions with other societies that make sure to make it to where people don't advance in this linear fashion. But if that were the case, we have to make sure but there is the possibility that we could, force this last stage. We could force this last stage. And if we force this last stage, we could very well reach a point where we become maybe an intergalactic civilization. And maybe we become really powerful post-scarcity economy. Really, you can draw any conclusions you want from this, but this has been Wabian Marxist Historical Materialism, an in-depth explanation, and really that just describes the entire ideology of Wabian Marxism, if you really think about it. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you want to support the channel. Thank you very much.